When a massive social or religious institution operates in the physical world, it is bound by physical laws. It possesses mass, it generates momentum, and it is subject to the mechanics of structural stress. Claiming a purely spiritual or mystical status provides no exemption from basic engineering logic. If a structure is built poorly, gravity will not ignore it out of reverence. To accurately measure these organizations, we have to bypass their subjective emotional defenses. We use a method called systemic diagnostics, treating the institution as a mechanical system that can be empirically tested. Our objective is straightforward. We are going to audit closed-loop institutional systems for internal corruption, using strict physical constraints and established legal benchmarks as our measuring tools. If an organization holds physical assets and operates in reality, its internal alignment can be mathematically and legally diagnosed. The math does not care about the institution's branding. Ecclesiastical and religious systems are not independent, sovereign authorities. Legally and functionally, they exist entirely as sub-licensed operators of a higher truth. They draw their authority from a primary developer, the origin, who holds the master structural blueprints for how the system is required to run. This relationship operates under what we can call a covenantal open-source license. It is a strict fiduciary agreement. The institution is permitted to operate, but only within the exact parameters established by the developer. If the institution begins quietly altering this original source code to suit its own administrative needs, it commits a fiduciary breach. This requirement aligns directly with secular benchmarks. Under 1 U.S.C. Section 1, the federal standard for rules of construction, words and definitions must maintain a stable, fixed meaning. You cannot build a stable legal structure if the definitions of the bricks keep changing. An institution draws its entire legitimacy from unyielding adherence to its original source code. Without that precise alignment, the system operates completely unauthorized. We can map this dynamic visually. In this structural blueprint, the absolute source of law and structure is the origin. Attached to it is the orbital. This represents the institutional closed loop, the church, the organization, or the social system operating under the license. Flowing from the origin into the orbital is the radiance. This is the high-frequency source code signal, the objective information powering the institution. To maintain this connection, the system requires a limit. This is a rigid, fixed boundary of consistency that forces the orbital to adhere to the source code, preventing it from drifting off path. By applying the federal rule of construction, 1 U.S.C. Section 1, to this limit, we establish that systemic terms and blueprints cannot fluctuate. The definitions are locked. Over time, institutions chafe against this strict boundary. They often attempt to label adherence to the limit as legalism. This is a defense mechanism used to justify overriding the original blueprints for their own operational convenience. Fluctuating definitions within an institution do not represent spiritual evolution. They are structural compromises that inevitably guarantee systemic collapse. To test the health of this system, we introduce an objective diagnostic instrument called the wedge. Its purpose is to verify the frequency alignment of the orbital. The wedge does not perform a hostile takeover. It merely queries the system with the original blueprints, sending a pulse to check the connection status. If the orbital's frequency has deviated from the source code, inserting the wedge triggers violent, visible friction. This friction is not a subjective interpersonal conflict between leaders and critics. It is the literal, kinetic byproduct of a low-frequency, closed loop resisting a high-frequency truth. Under Federal Rule of Evidence 201, Section B, institutional hostility in the face of original documentation qualifies as an adjudicative fact. Observers can legally notice and measure this violent reaction. Corrupt systems routinely attempt to assassinate the character of the messenger delivering the diagnostic. It is a tactical move to remove the wedge and silence the signal exposing their deviation. Extreme internal friction in response to original blueprints is not a valid defense. It is visual, legally measurable proof that a fiduciary breach has occurred. A system's internal state is eventually made visible through its material outputs, a category we call density. Density encompasses the finances, the real estate portfolios, and the social equity harvested by the institution over years of operation. When auditors or observers question the integrity of the organization, the system typically deploys a legal shield known as the ecclesiastical abstinence doctrine. By invoking this doctrine, the institution claims its internal operations are purely spiritual. The goal is to place its behavior completely out of bounds for objective empirical auditing. The paradox is physical. A system cannot legally demand spiritual immunity while simultaneously managing, taxing, and soliciting massive physical density. Courts utilize the neutral principles of law standard to resolve this. It dictates that an entity is evaluated based on its physical fruits, its tangible assets and actions, regardless of the religious branding pasted on the door. If an institution relies on its density to camouflage structural deviations while continuing to solicit resources, it commits fraudulent inducement. At that point, it must be judged strictly as a failed secular corporation. Look at the thermodynamic result when an institution permanently rejects the diagnostic wedge and severs itself from the source code. It succumbs to entropy. The universal law of thermodynamics dictates that any closed system, isolated from its source, degrades from order into disorder. The institution enters a state of functional entropy. This is the critical threshold where the organization loses its ability to produce the transformational work defined in its original blueprints. Cut off from external input, the effort required to maintain its unaligned, self-referential loop now consumes 100% of the institution's available energy. In physical terms, the system generates immense institutional heat and administrative friction, but it outputs zero objective light. The mathematical endpoint of this isolation is total systemic chaos. Order breaks down, and survival becomes the only remaining function. Systemic malfeasance, prioritizing the survival of the institution's loop over the accuracy of the source code, is a mathematically unsustainable proposition. This leaves the isolated institution in a terminal state, the zombie orbital. A zombie orbital is an entity that possesses massive physical density, sprawling campuses, large staffs, and full accounts, but retains zero functional connection to the developer. It projects a systemic illusion. The institution spins at high speeds, tricking observers into seeing momentum, even though the core is spiritually inert. This state triggers the ultimate systemic benchmark, the Ichabod verdict. This term marks the definitive signal loss threshold. At this threshold, the developer's license is officially revoked. The high-frequency signal departs the loop entirely to find viable, accurately aligned vessels. The autopsy of such an organization reveals a stark reality. The institution requires no hostile takeover or external attack to fall. It will inevitably collapse under the sheer weight of its own unaligned mass. The legal Proto framework leaves us with a final axiom. Structure structly governs frequency. Physical density proves internal alignment. And a disconnected institution is already functionally dead.